When were the first Olympic Games?
The Olympics date to about 900 B. C. When, in ancient Greece, tens of thousands of sandal-wearing spectators descended on Olympia to cheer the runners, wrestlers, and bare-skinned boxers competing there. The Games at Olympia were one of 4 athletic festivals in Greece, the others being the Isthmian Games at Corinth, the Nemean Games, and the Pythian Games at Delphi, all of which alternated to form the Periodos, or circuits, which guaranteed sports fans the opportunity to attend an athletic festival every year. Winning was everything then. Athletes were required to register in order to compete, and rumors of Herculean opponents sometimes prompted competitors to withdraw. Victors were awarded crowns of olive leaves, and the second and third place finishers returned home undecorated. The modern Olympic Games, begun by diminutive Frenchman Baron Pierre de Coubertin, 1862 to 1937, possess a decidedly different spirit than did their ancient counterpart, where the only rules were that participants were not allowed to gouge, bite, put a knee to the groin, strangle, or throw sand at their opponent. The modern Olympic Games, publicly proposed by Coubertin on November 25, 1892, in Paris, and first held in Athens, Greece, in 1896, are based on their initiators' vision of the Olympic competition as an occasion to promote peace, harmony, and internationalism. In April 1896, some 40,000 spectators pressed into the Panathinaean Stadium, which had been constructed on the site of an ancient stadium in Athens, to witness the athletic feats of the first modern Olympic heroes. 13 nations participated, only male athletes, just more than 300 of them competed, and Greece received the most medals, 47. The second Olympic Games were held in 1900 in Paris.
Who was Dante's Beatrice?
In Dante's masterpiece The Divine Comedy, the central figure is led to redemption by a character named Beatrice. His earlier guide through hell and purgatory was the great Roman poet Virgil. Dante Alighieri, 1265–1321, was born in Florence, Italy, where he also spent much of his life. In 1274, at the age of 9, he was introduced to Beatrice Portinari. They met again 9 years later, and Dante was profoundly affected by her beauty and grace. When she died in 1290, Dante was inspired to commemorate her in several works, most notably the Divine Comedy, c. 1308–1321. Beatrice is also depicted in Dante's The New Life, c. 1293, a collection of 31 love poems. He wrote The Banquet, c. 1304–1307, another collection of lyrical poems, to commemorate Beatrice's death.
What was the first university in the Western Hemisphere?
It was the University of Santo Domingo, founded in 1538 by the Spaniards in the Dominican Republic, which occupies the eastern half of the Caribbean island of Hispaniola.
What is the difference between the Roman Empire and the Holy Roman Empire?
Roughly 4.5 centuries separated the two empires, both of which were comprised of vast regions of Western and Central Europe. The Roman Empire was established in 27 BC, when Augustus, also known as Octavian, 63 B.Ca.D14, the grandnephew, adopted son, and chosen heir of Julius Caesar, 100 to 44 BC, became emperor. His reign lasted until AD 476, when Rome fell to Germanic tribes. The Holy Roman Empire, HRE, began in the mid-900s AD, when Otto I, 912 to 973, of Germany gained control of most of northern and central Italy. Pope John XII, c. 937 to 964, crowned Otto emperor in 962. In the 1200s the area of power officially became known as the Holy Roman Empire. The HRE was dismantled July 12, 1806, in the Confederation of the Rhine, which brought most of the German states under French domination, the result of the Napoleonic Wars. But even after Napoleon Bonaparte, 1769 to 1821, was permanently ousted as head of France in 1815. There were no attempts to reinstate the Holy Roman Empire.
How could so many people, Hutus, have participated in the mass cleansing?
Experts point to Rwanda's deeply divided history. The rivalry between Hutus and Tutsis dates back hundreds of years, since the Tutsis first arrived in the Central African region in the 14th century.
What was the Ottoman Empire?
It was a vast Turkish state founded in the 13th century by the Osmani Turks. Turks who were led by descendants of Osman I, 1258 c. 1326, by the middle of the next century, the Ottoman Empire consisted roughly of modern-day Turkey. The terms Turkey and Ottoman Empire are used interchangeably. The empire was expanded further by conquests during the 1400s, including the conquest of the Byzantine Empire in 1453. At its height, the Byzantine Empire extended over an area that included the Balkan Peninsula, present-day Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Macedonia, Yugoslavia, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, Greece, and Turkey, Syria, Egypt, Iraq, the northern coast of Africa, Palestine, and parts of Arabia, Russia, and Hungary. The capital was placed at Constantinople, present-day Istanbul, Turkey. Thus the Turks established a Muslim empire that would remain a formidable force and influence in the region and in Europe for the next 3 centuries. During the 1500s and 1600s, the Ottoman Empire was the most powerful in the world. It reached its most glorious heights during the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, 1494 to 1566. Who ruled from 1520 to 1566, it was he who added parts of Hungary to the Ottoman territory. He also tried to take Vienna, but failed. He did succeed in strengthening the Ottoman navy, which dominated the Mediterranean Sea. Suleiman was not only an expansionist, but a patron of the arts and a builder. He ordered the construction of mosques. To spread the Islamic religion throughout the empire, bridges, and other public works. But by the time World War I began in 1914, the Ottoman Empire had been in decline for some 300 years and only consisted of Asia Minor, parts of southwestern Asia, and part of the Balkan Peninsula. As one of the losing Central Powers, the Ottoman Empire was dissolved in 1922 by the peace treaties that ended the war.
What was the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre?
It was a mass murder in 1572, which began on August 24, the Roman Catholic feast day of St. Bartholomew. The slaughter, which eventually claimed an estimated 70,000 lives, was part of decades of civil wars between Roman Catholics and Protestants, Huguenots, in France. The Protestant Reformation had begun in 1517, and it spread through Europe over the following decades. By the 1560s, as many as 1/3 of the French people were Protestants. The growth of a Reformed Christian faith threatened the Roman Catholic Church and eroded its power, both religious and political. In 1560, Charles IX, 1550 to 1574, a Roman Catholic, rose to power in France. But since he was just 10 years old at the time, the country was ruled by a regent, his mother, Catherine de' Medicis, 1519 to 1589. Catherine was a descendant of the powerful Medici family of Florence and, as the wife of King Henry II, 1519 to 1559, the Queen of France. Even after Charles IX reached the age of majority, she continued to dominate him. By 1572, Catherine feared the growing influence that another person, Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, 1519 to 1572, had on her son, the king. Coligny was a leader of the Huguenots, the French Protestants, and, in fact, he did hold sway over Charles IX. To remove this threat, Catherine authorized a plot by Roman Catholic nobles to assassinate Coligny. On August 18, Catherine's daughter, Margaret of Valois, 1553–1615, was married to Henry of Navarre, 1553–1610, a Huguenot. The royal event brought many Huguenot nobles to Paris. On August 22, an attempt was made on Coligny's life, but he survived. Catherine feared that an investigation into the attack on Coligny would reveal her role in it. She therefore gave approval to a wider plan to exterminate Huguenots. And she convinced her son, Charles IX, to order it. According to French statesman and historian Jacques-Auguste de Thou, 1553–1617. The order stated that it was the will of the king that, according to God's will, they should take vengeance on the band of rebels the Huguenots while they had the beasts in the toils. The massacre began with the toll of a palace bell on August 24. Those who carried out the killings on the Huguenot leaders identified themselves with white armbands and a white cross on their hats. Coligny was among the first victims, but Protestants throughout Paris were targeted. As citizens became involved in the mayhem, several thousand perished in the city, causing the waters of the river Seine to run red. Throughout the provinces over the next several weeks, thousands more died, the victims of mob attacks on Protestants. News of the attacks was greeted with approval by Roman Catholic leaders. Protestants throughout Europe were horrified. The plot carried out on St. Bartholomew's Day had launched a mass extermination, fueling the hatred between Catholics and Protestants.
Who was Hawaii Loa?
He was a Polynesian chief who sailed some 2,400 miles of open water from the Marquesas Islands near Tahiti, to discover the Hawaiian Islands in the A.D. 400s. The islands were first discovered by Europeans in 1778 when British navigator Captain James Cook 1728–1779, landed on the island of Kauai and named the islands after John Montagu, c. 1718–1792, who was the 4th Earl of Sandwich and First Lord of the Admiralty. Captain Cook died there at the hand of the natives in a skirmish over a stolen boat.
Who was tried at Nuremberg?
Following World War II, 1939–45. 22 leaders of Nazi Germany were put on trial at Nuremberg's Palace of Justice. The International Military Tribunal began the proceedings on November 25, 1945, and they were not concluded until September 30 of the following year. The verdicts were announced on October 1. The site was deliberately selected by the Allies. The now bombed-out city of Nuremberg was considered a seat of Nazi power, though many, including Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, 1979–1953, thought that Hitler's henchmen ought only to be tried as a show of justice before they were executed. Others, notably U.S. Chief Prosecutor Robert Jackson, 1892–1954, believed due process of law must be observed. The American view prevailed. The tribunal indicted 23 Nazi leaders on 4 counts: conspiracy, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. One of the defendants, Robert Ley, 1890 to 1945, committed suicide in prison before the trial began. The case against the Nazis was based on a mountain of written evidence, such as orders, reports, manifests, logs, letters, and diaries. The Germans had scrupulously recorded their evil deeds. The presentation of the documents was punctuated with live testimony of a German civilian contractor who, out of curiosity, had followed a Nazi detachment to an embankment where several thousand Jewish men, women, and children were shot and buried in a pit, and of a French woman, a survivor of the horrors of Auschwitz, recollecting a night when children had been hurled into furnaces alive, since the Nazis had run out of fuel. The atrocities were rendered unimaginably horrific by the sheer number of Nazi victims, which included 3.7 million, of the 5.7 million captured, Soviet troops who died in prison. 4 million Jews who died in extermination camps, and the murder of at least 2 million more Jews elsewhere. The defense was prohibited from employing a "you did it, too" argument, which would have been an attempt to justify their actions by claiming it was all part of war. The Allies were determined to bring the Nazis to justice for their appalling and diabolical acts. Among those tried at Nuremberg were Hitler's chief deputy Hermann Göring, 1893 to 1946, whom a New Yorker correspondent covering the trials described as a brain without a conscience. Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, 1893 to 1946, and Armaments Minister Albert Speer, 1905 to 1981. Göring and Ribbentrop were among the 5 men found guilty on all 4 counts against them. They were sentenced to hang. 6 others were found guilty of crimes against humanity and were all sentenced to hang. A 7th man, Martin Bormann, 1900 to 45, who had been tried in absentia, was also sentenced to hang if he were found to be alive. 7 others were also found guilty on 1 or 2 counts and were sentenced to prison terms ranging from 10 years to life. 3 were acquitted on all 4 counts. Göring escaped his hanging, though he was to be closely monitored by his jailers. He managed to secure a vial of cyanide, which he swallowed a few hours before his scheduled execution. Since Bormann was at large, 10 Nazis died in the 3 gallows that had been constructed in the prison gym of the Palace of Justice. The trials at Nuremberg cemented the principle that wartime leaders are accountable under international law for their crimes and immoralities.
How many amendments have been made to the U.S. Constitution?
There have been 27 amendments to date. The following list gives brief summaries and the year each became part of the U.S. Constitution. First Amendment through the 10th Amendment, 1791 comprise the Bill of Rights. 11th Amendment, 1798 declares that U.S. federal courts cannot try Any case brought against a state by a citizen of another state or country. 12th Amendment, 1804 revised the presidential and vice presidential election rules such that members of the Electoral College, called electors, vote for one person as president and for another as vice president. Prior to the passage of this amendment, the electors simply voted for two men. The one receiving more votes became president and the other became vice president. 13th Amendment, 1865 prohibits slavery. Along with Amendments 14 and 15, these are sometimes called the Civil War Amendments. 14th Amendment, 1868. Defines U.S. citizenship and gives all citizens equal protection under the law. This amendment made former slaves citizens of both the United States and the state where they lived. It further forbade states to deny equal rights to any person. 15th Amendment, 1870 states that the right of U.S. citizens to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. This amendment was meant to extend suffrage to black men. 16th Amendment, 1913 authorizes a federal income tax. 17th Amendment, 1913 provides for the direct election of senators. Before this passed, state legislatures elected senators to represent them. This amendment gave that power to the people of each state. 18th Amendment, 1919 made prohibition legal. In other words, the manufacture and distribution of alcohol became illegal. 19th Amendment, 1920 grants women the right to vote. 20th Amendment, 1933 also called the Lame Duck Amendment. It changed congressional terms of office and the dates of the presidential inauguration, so that newly elected officials take office closer to election time. 21st Amendment, 1933 repealed Amendment 18 to end prohibition. 22nd Amendment, 1951 limits presidential tenure to 2 terms in office. A president can hold office for no more than 10 years, 2 years as an unelected president, and 2 terms as an elected president. 23rd Amendment, 1961 grants residents of Washington, D.C., the right to vote in presidential elections. 24th Amendment, 1964 outlaws the poll tax in all federal elections and primaries. Some states had used poll taxes as a way of keeping certain populations of voters from casting their ballots. The practice had served to disenfranchise blacks and poor people. 25th Amendment, 1967 provides for procedures to fill the vice presidency and further clarifies presidential succession rules. Upon removal, resignation, or death of the president, the vice president assumes the presidency. If a vice president is removed, resigns, or dies while in office, the president nominates a vice president who takes office upon confirmation by a majority vote of both houses of Congress. 26th Amendment, 1971 lowers the voting age for federal and state elections to 18. 27th Amendment. 1992 prevents Congress from passing immediate salary increases for itself. It requires that salary changes passed by Congress cannot take effect until after the next congressional election. This amendment had been passed by Congress in 1788 and was then sent to the states for ratification. Since the amendment had no time limit for ratification, it became part of the Constitution in 1992. After Michigan became the 38th state to ratify it.
Was the Holocaust directed by the German government?
Yes. When fervent nationalist Adolf Hitler, 1889 to 1945, rose to power in Germany in 1933, he quickly established a reign of terror based on his philosophy that the German, Aryan, race is superior to all others. He established a violent policy against Jews, those who did not flee the country were rounded up and sent to concentration camps, where they were kept without cause. This was before Hitler's acts of military aggression in Europe. But after German troops invaded Poland and World War II began, the Führer's anti-Semitic campaign was accelerated. Jews in Germany and in Nazi-occupied countries of Europe were severely persecuted. Those who were put into concentration camps including Auschwitz, Treblinka, Buchenwald, and Dachau were exterminated, many of them in gas chambers. By the end of the war, in 1945, Hitler's final solution to the Jewish question had been underway for some 12 years. And 6 million Jews had been systematically murdered by the Nazis during the Holocaust, or Shoah, Hebrew. As his defeat was imminent, the despotic ruler took his own life in 1945. By then he had destroyed Europe's Jewish community. Many of Hitler's leaders were later tried by an international court at Nuremberg.
What impact did Love Canal have?
The effect of the crisis was felt on many levels, by area residents whose lives were forever changed by the hazards, by residents nearby Love Canal who feared for their own safety, by Americans across the country who lived near other chemical waste sites, and by Americans for whom Love Canal had become synonymous with the problems posed by hazardous waste. At the government level, the tragic events at Love Canal helped to speed the passage of the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act of 1980, also known as the Superfund. The legislation set up a multi-billion-dollar fund to clean up the nation's worst toxic disasters. The Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, assigned cleanup priority to some 200 abandoned and potentially contaminated waste sites. Along with the chemical plant explosion at Bhopal, India, in 1984, Love Canal also contributed to a community right to know provision, which was part of the 1985 Superfund Amendments and Reauthorization Act. The new legislation gave all citizens the right to know what chemicals are produced, stored, or buried in their neighborhoods.
Who started the Underground Railroad?
American abolitionist, lecturer, and nurse Harriet Tubman, c. 1820 to 1913, set up the network to emancipate slaves. Tubman was motivated to do so after she had made her way to freedom in 1849, and then wished the same for her family. I had crossed the line of which I had so long been dreaming. I was free, but there was no one to welcome me to the land of freedom. For the next 10 years Tubman acted as a conductor on the Underground Railroad, making at least 15 trips into southern slave states, and guiding not only her parents and siblings, but more than 300 slaves to freedom in the North. She was called the Moses of her people for her emancipation efforts. The journeys to freedom were demanding and often dangerous missions. Though Tubman was small in stature, she possessed extraordinary leadership qualities. Author, clergyman, and Army officer Thomas Wentworth Higginson, 1823 to 1911, called her the greatest heroine of the age.
What was the temperance movement?
Temperance was an American movement that began in the mid-1800s to outlaw the manufacture and consumption of alcoholic beverages, which were viewed by many to be a corrupt influence on American family life. By 1855, growing public support to ban liquor resulted in 31 states making it illegal to some degree. But a national policy of temperance was still sought by many. During the 1870s, temperance became one of the cornerstones of the growing women's movement. As the nation's women, joined by other activists, mobilized to gain suffrage, the right to vote, they also espoused sweeping cultural changes. In 1874, a group of women established the Woman's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU. In 1895, the Anti-Saloon League was formed. Such societies, which grew out of a fundamentalist spirit, found an increasing voice and eventually influenced legislators, many of whom were dry candidates that the societies had supported, to take federal action. Even President Woodrow Wilson, 1856 to 1924, supported prohibition as one of the domestic policies of his New Freedom program. The movement met with success in January 16, 1919, when the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, 1788, was ratified, forbidding people to make, sell, or transport intoxicating liquors in the United States and in all territories within its jurisdiction. Though Congress, which proposed the amendment on December 18, 1917, provided states with a period of 7 years in which to ratify the amendment, It took just over a year for it to be approved, such was the prevailing spirit among lawmakers. After the amendment was made, Congress passed the Volstead Act to enforce it. But government nevertheless found prohibition difficult to enforce. Bootleggers, who made their own moonshine illegal spirits, often distilled at night. Rum runners, who imported liquor, principally from neighboring Canada and Mexico. And speakeasies, underground establishments that sold liquor to their clientele, proliferated. Soon organized crime ran the distribution of liquor in the country, whose citizens had not lost their taste for alcoholic beverages. The government now found itself with a bigger problem. As the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, and police worked to control and end mob violence. And as the country suffered through the early years of the Great Depression, lawmakers in Washington reconsidered the amendment. On February 20, 1933, the U.S. Congress proposed that the 18th Amendment be repealed. Approved by the states in December of that year, the 21st Amendment declared the 18th Amendment null. And the manufacture, transportation, and consumption of alcoholic beverages was again legal in the United States, ending the 13-year period of prohibition. Herbert Hoover, 1874 to 1964, president at the time of repeal, called prohibition a noble experiment.
When was the first human organ transplant?
The first human organ transplant occurred on June 17, 1950, at the Little Company of Mary Hospital in Evergreen Park, Illinois. The suburban Chicago Hospital, better known as the Baby Hospital for the high number of births there each year, was an unlikely place for this landmark in medical history. And the doctors who took part in the transplant tried to keep the highly experimental procedure quiet. The subject was a 44-year-old woman who suffered from polycystic kidney disease. She received a donor organ, a kidney, from a cadaver, making the procedure even more controversial for the Catholic hospital. At the time, the Church was opposed to the idea that tissue could be taken from a dead person and put into a living person, and that the tissue would then come to life again. But the three doctors who performed the procedure had the confidence and trust of the sisters running the hospital. Doctors James W. West, Richard H. Lawler, and Raymond P. Murphy were surgeons on the faculty at Loyola Strict School of Medicine and the Cook County Hospital, but also practiced at Little Company of Mary. The operation was the last resort for the patient, who had seen her mother, sister, and uncle die from the same disease. Word leaked about the operation, and several days after the procedure, when the patient was doing well, the hospital and doctors went public with their breakthrough, making headlines around the world. The transplanted kidney functioned in the patient for about 6 weeks, enough time for her other kidney to begin working again. She lived another 5 years before finally succumbing to the disease. On December 23, 1954, Harvard University physicians led by surgeon Joseph E. Murray, 1919, performed the world's first successful transplant from a living donor. The patient's identical twin brother. The operation took place at Peter Bent Brigham Hospital, now Brigham and Women's Hospital. Since the patient and the donor had the same genetic makeup, organ rejection was not an issue. The procedure saved the patient's life, and the well-publicized breakthrough immediately opened up the possibility for similar transplants between identical twins, as well as for the transplantation of other organs. Dr. Murray and other Harvard researchers continued working on the problem of rejection, eventually developing new drugs that reduce the possibility that a recipient would reject an organ from a non-relative. In 1990, Murray was awarded the Nobel Prize for his pioneering work. He shared the prize with his friend and colleague E. Donald Thomas, 1920, an innovator in bone marrow transplant. Today, tens of thousands of organs are transplanted each year in the United States. In October 2004, doctors performed the first organ transplant arranged and brokered over the Internet.
What were the Hussite Wars?
The Hussite Wars were fought in the former Kingdom of Bohemia, part of present-day Czech Republic. Between 1420 and 1433, the country was plunged into the 13-year war by festering hostilities between papal forces and Bohemian peasants. The Hussites, named such since they were followers of religious reformer Jan Hus, c. 1373 to 1415, in the Four Articles of Prague, 1420, the Hussites called for freedom of preaching, limits to church property holding, and civil punishment of mortal sin. The fighting ended in 1433 with the Compromise of the Council of Basel, and 3 years later was officially ended by the Compact of Vigo, 1436. In which a faction of the Hussites agreed to accept the Holy Roman Emperor as king. The peasants had succeeded nevertheless in asserting Bohemian nationalism and had severed the country's ties to Germany.
How old is the Parthenon?
The ancient temple, originally built on the Acropolis, a hill overlooking the city of Athens, was constructed between 447 and 432 B.C. by Greeks. The white marble edifice, considered a prime example of Greek architecture, has an interesting history. About AD 500, it became a Christian church. In the mid-1400s, when the region was captured by Turkish Muslims, it was turned into a mosque. And in 1687, when Venetians tried to take the city, the Parthenon was severely damaged. Only ruins remain today.
When did the Cold War begin?
In the years following the conclusion of World War II, 1939–45, the nations of Western Europe and the United States became alarmed by Soviet advances into Eastern Europe. And many Europeans and Americans voiced concerns that communists, led by the Soviet Union, were plotting to take over the world. Political leaders in England, the United States, and elsewhere referred to this new menace in grim terms. In March 1946, former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, 1874–1965, warned of an Iron Curtain of Soviet totalitarianism that had divided the European continent, and in 1947 U.S. President Harry S. Truman, 1884–1972, announced a policy of containment of communist incursion into other countries. This policy came to be known as the Truman Doctrine, and it remained an integral part of American foreign policy for the next 40 years. Ultimately leading to the nation's involvement in the Korean War, 1950–53, and the Vietnam War, 1954–75. The eroding relationship between the Western powers and the Soviet-led countries of Eastern Europe was largely brought on by disagreements over Germany. At the close of World War II, marked differences of opinion on what to do with Germany had resulted in a plan for joint government of the nation by the Allies, the Soviet Union, the United States, Britain, and France. But the arrangement quickly proved unworkable. By 1948 Germany was in serious economic straits, and the United States, Britain, and France began to discuss uniting their zones. The Soviets responded by ordering a blockade of land and water traffic into Berlin, control of which had been divided between the Allies after the war. The Soviets controlled East Berlin, while the other Allies controlled West Berlin. To counter the blockade, Great Britain and the United States ordered an airlift operation to provide food and other supplies to the people of West Berlin, alleviating the effects of the 11-month Soviet blockade. In 1949 the East-West differences resulted in the formal division of Germany into two countries. West Germany, formed by the zones occupied by the United States, Great Britain, and France, was allowed to form a democratic government, and it became officially known as the Federal Republic of Germany. The same year, East Germany, also known as the German Democratic Republic, was formed out of the Soviet zones and was folded into the Eastern Bloc countries. By 1949, the year that the Soviet Union exploded its first nuclear bomb, the world had been roughly divided into two camps: the United States and its democratic allies, which included the nations of Western Europe, and other anti-communist governments, and the Eastern Bloc, the Soviet Union and its satellite countries. These camps were soon girded by formal political alliances. In 1949 a military alliance known as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, was formed by 12 nations: the United States, Great Britain, France, Italy, Norway, Portugal, Iceland, Denmark, Canada, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. By 1955 three more countries, Greece, Turkey, and West Germany, joined the alliance. The Soviet Union responded by creating the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, Comecon, in 1949 and the Warsaw Pact in 1955. Comecon was an effort to coordinate economic and industrial activities among communist nations, while the Warsaw Pact was a military agreement between the Soviets and the communist governments of Eastern Europe. The Cold War was on.
Why was the Persian Gulf War important?
The Six-Week War, telecast around the world from start to finish, February-April 1991. Was significant because it was the first major international crisis to take place in the post-Cold War era. The United Nations proved to be effective in organizing the coalition against aggressor Iraq. Leading members of the coalition included Egypt, France, Great Britain, Saudi Arabia, Syria, and the United States. The conflict also tested the ability of the United States and the Soviet Union, then still in existence as such, to cooperate in world affairs.
How old is guerrilla warfare?
Guerrilla warfare dates back to ancient times but got its name during the Peninsular War of 1809 to 1814 when Napoleon Bonaparte 1769 to 1821 fought for control of the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal. In Spanish, guerrilla means small war. The resistance to Napoleon's troops employed tactics that are typical of what we know as guerrilla warfare, fighting in small bands, ambushes, sudden raids, and sabotage. It is Chinese Communist leader Mao Zedong, 1893 to 1976, who, in his 22-year fight against the Chinese nationalists, from 1927 to 1949, is believed to have developed the techniques of modern guerrilla warfare. Chairman Mao slowly but surely gained the support and sympathy of the common people, in particular those living in rural areas. Eventually, he had control of the masses who believed the reforms he would make once in office would be favorable to them. The people would provide the manpower and supplies that would sustain the fight. If any followers faulted in their loyalty to the cause, they would be punished. Today, guerrillas rely on terrorist attacks against governments, goading the military into action, which, in turn, rallies the public in its outrage against government. In this way, guerrilla movements can gain popular support over time. Such movements are by no means limited to the countryside. Urban attacks include tactics such as kidnapping and assassination. Such guerrilla measures have led to the outbreak of civil wars.
How old is the compass?
The first compass dates back to the 1st century B. c. When the Chinese observed that pieces of lodestone, an iron mineral, always pointed north when they were placed on a surface. There is evidence that Arab sailors were using compasses as early as AD 600, and as Arab influence spread north into Europe, so did the compass. By the 14th century, European ships carried maps that were charted with compass readings to reach different destinations. Portugal's Prince Henry, 1394–1460, also called Henry the Navigator, advanced the use of compasses in navigation by encouraging sailors and mapmakers to coordinate their information to make more accurate maps of the seas. Also in the 15th century, an important observation was made by none other than Genoese navigator and explorer from Spain Christopher Columbus, 1451–1506. Who noticed that as he sailed to the New World, his compass did not align directly with the North Star. The difference between magnetic north and true north is called declination. In the 16th and 17th centuries, scientists began to better understand Earth's magnetic fields. American Elmer Sperry, 1860–1930, built the first gyro compass, a device that works day or night, anywhere on Earth, even at the poles, where lines of force are too close together for magnetic devices to function properly. When the gyro compass is pointed north, it holds that position. Before the compass, which simply indicates north by a means of a magnetic needle or needles that pivot. Sailors used the sun, the moon, and the stars to determine direction and navigate their ships.
Why was the battle at Gettysburg important?
The 1863 battle, fought when the two sides met accidentally in the southern Pennsylvania town, was a turning point in the Civil War. From July 1 to 3, General George Meade, 1815–1872, led his troops, about 90,000 strong, to defeat the advancing Confederate troops, numbering some 75,000, under General Robert E. Lee. 1807–1870, the Union win effectively stopped Lee's invasion of the North. The following November 19, President Abraham Lincoln, 1809–1865, made the historical address at Gettysburg, as he dedicated part of the battlefield as a national cemetery. Beginning with the now famous words, 77 years ago our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. The short speech, which Lincoln rewrote many times, closed by issuing a rallying cry for the nation as a whole, saying, "We here highly resolve that the dead shall not have died in vain, that the nation shall, under God, have a new birth of freedom, and that governments of the people, by the people, and for the people, shall not perish from the earth."
What was the Trojan War?
According to Greek legend, the Trojan War was a 10-year siege, c. 1200 BC, on the ancient city of Troy, also called Ilium. The Greek poet Homer, c. 850-BC, chronicled the Trojan War in his epic the Iliad. According to Homer, the Greek Mycenaeans, under their great king Agamemnon, set out to conquer the city of Troy. Situated on the Turkish coast at the southwestern part of the Hellespont. The Hellespont, now called the Dardanelles, and the Bosporus are narrow straits that connect the Aegean Sea with the Black Sea. As such, they are the gateway between Europe and Asia. And in Mycenaean times they held the key to control of the profitable Black Sea trade. In hopes of taking over that trade, Agamemnon's army attacked the powerful city of Troy, launching the decade-long campaign. The mythological war likely reflected a real war that was fought over the Dardanelles about 1200 BC.
How did the Renaissance begin?
Social and political developments in the late Middle Ages gave rise to the spirit of the Renaissance. The Crusades, 1096 to 1291, the military expeditions undertaken by Christian powers to win the Holy Land from the Muslims brought Europeans into contact with other cultures and most importantly with Byzantine civilization. The remnant of the East Roman Empire, Byzantium had preserved the knowledge of ancient times. In addition, many texts thought to have been destroyed during the tribal ransacking of the West Roman Empire in the 5th century AD, remained preserved in various translations throughout the Middle East. So it was during the Crusades that some of these were brought back to Europe, where classical scholars undertook the task of deciphering the West's cultural past. In northern Italy, a series of city-states developed independent of the larger empires to the north and south of them. These small states, Florence, Rome, Venice, and Milan, among others, gained prosperity through trade and banking. And as a result, a wealthy class of businessmen emerged. These community leaders admired and encouraged creativity, patronizing artists who might glorify their commercial achievement with great buildings, paintings, and sculptures. The most influential patrons of the arts were the Medicis, a wealthy banking family in Florence. Members of the Medici family supported many important artists, including Botticelli and Michelangelo. Guided by the Medici patronage, Florence became the most magnificent city of the period. One way patrons encouraged art was to sponsor competitions. In order to spur artists to more significant achievement. In many cases, the losers of these contests went on to greater fame than the winners. After his defeat in the competition to create the bronze doors of the Baptistery of Florence Cathedral, architect Filippo Brunelleschi, 1377–1446, made several trips to take measurements of the ruined buildings of ancient Rome. When he returned to Florence, he created the immense Il Duomo, dome, of the Santa Maria del Fiore Cathedral. a classically influenced structure that became the first great monument of the Renaissance.
What was the Supreme Court's role in racial segregation?
Though most segregation laws, or Jim Crow laws, were overturned by decisions of the Supreme Court during the 1950s and 1960s, the court was righting its own wrong. In the late 1800s, during the years following the Civil War, 1861 to 65, and the abolition of slavery, the Supreme Court made rulings that actually supported segregation laws at the state level. The most famous of these was the 1896 case of Plessy v. Ferguson, in which the highest court in the land upheld the constitutionality of Louisiana's law requiring separate but equal facilities for whites and blacks in railroad cars. One strong dissenting opinion came from Associate Justice John Marshall Harlan, who declared the Constitution is color blind. Following the Plessy v. Ferguson decision, states went on to use the separate but equal principle for 50 years, passing Jim Crow laws that set up racial segregation in public schools, transportation, and in recreation, sleeping, and eating facilities. This meant there were drinking fountains, benches, restrooms, bus seats, hospital beds, and theater sections designated as whites only or colored. One Arkansas law even provided that witnesses being sworn in to testify in a courtroom be given different Bibles depending on the color of their skin. Two landmark Supreme Court decisions came in 1954 and 1960 in the cases of Brown v. the Board of Education and Boynton v. Virginia. In the first case, parents of black children in Topeka, Kansas, elementary schools charged that the segregation of white and black students in the public schools denied black children the equal protection cited in the 14th Amendment, 1868. The parents were supported in their fight by the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, whose legal counsel included Thurgood Marshall, 1908 to 1993. On May 17, 1954, the Supreme Court ruled that segregated schools do violate the Equal Protection Clause, overturning the separate but equal doctrine previously upheld by Plessy v. Ferguson. The federal government again made a stand against state segregation laws when, in December 1960, Chief Appellant Lawyer Thurgood Marshall argued the case of Howard University law student Bruce Boynton before the Supreme Court, again ruling in favor of the plaintiff, who had charged that the segregation laws at the Richmond, Virginia, bus station violated the federal anti-segregation laws. Washington sent a clear message to the states that public facilities are for the use of all citizens, regardless of color. These decisions combined with the activism of the civil rights movement to outlaw racial segregation.
What are the Hague Conventions?
They are international treaties, 1899, 1907, covering the laws and customs of war. The First Hague Convention developed out of the Peace Conference of 1899, held in The Hague, the Netherlands, and convened by Russian Tsar Nicholas II, 1868 to 1918. Among the original goals was limiting the expansion of armed forces. Though the representatives there, from 26 nations, including the United States, failed to agree on a resolution to limit such expansion, they did agree on certain rules of engagement for war on land and at sea. Also, very importantly, they adopted the Convention for the Pacific Settlement of International Disputes. This convention set up the Permanent International Court of Arbitration and Justice, still in existence today. The court is in The Hague, where it is housed in the Peace Palace. A gift of American industrialist and philanthropist Andrew Carnegie, 1835 to 1919. A later convention, the Second Hague Peace Conference, was held in 1907. Representatives of 44 nations met for a period of 4 months. The Convention of 1907 modified and added to the first. Delegates resolved to meet again in 1915. But that conference was not held due to the outbreak of the First World War. The Hague Conventions were the forerunners of the League of Nations and the United Nations. How was the makeup of the U.S.?
How did the Charleston get started?
The Charleston, a lively ballroom dance, emerged in 1923 as one of the flashy elements of the period in American history that writer F. Scott Fitzgerald, 1896 to 1940, dubbed the Jazz Age. Other hallmarks of the Jazz Age, also called the Roaring Twenties, were speakeasies. Since the country was in the midst of prohibition, flappers, roadsters, raccoon coats, hedonism, and iconoclasm, the optimism of the Jazz Age came to a screeching halt on October 29, 1929. When the U.S. stock market crashed.
How was the United Nations formed?
Officially, the United Nations, UN, was not formed until October 1945. However, events during World War II, 1939–45, had paved the way for the founding of the International peacekeeping organization that today is so familiar to people around the globe. Fervent German nationalist Adolf Hitler, 1889–1945, and his troops invaded Poland in 1939. And soon Nazi Germany had conquered much of Europe. Leaders of 9 nations: Belgium, Czechoslovakia, France, Greece, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Poland, and Yugoslavia met with Britain and its Commonwealth states in London. There, on June 12, 1941, the countries signed the Inter-Allied Declaration, vowing to work together for a free world. 2 months later, on August 14, U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. 1882 to 1945, and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, 1874 to 1965, signed the Atlantic Charter. In it the two leaders outlined their aims for peace. On January 1, 1942, the declaration by the United Nations was signed by 26 countries who pledged to work together to fight the Axis powers. Germany, Italy, and Japan, and they agreed not to make peace separately. The term United Nations, otherwise known as the UN, is believed to have originated with Roosevelt. In late November and early December 1943, the Big Three Roosevelt, Churchill, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin, 1879 to 1953, met in Tehran, Iran, for the first time during the war. There these Allied nations leaders cited the responsibility of a United Nations organization in keeping the peace once the war was over. Though ending the war was first and foremost in the minds of these leaders. All had seen 2 world wars fought in close succession and were determined that the nations of the world could work together to prevent such an event from happening again. In August 1944, at the Dumbarton Oaks Conference in Washington, D.C., representatives of Britain, the United States, the Soviet Union, and China met to make plans for the peacekeeping organization that had been envisioned. The outcome of that meeting, which lasted into October, was the basic concept for the UN Security Council as we know it, with the world's 5 major powers having permanent seats on the council and a limited and rotating membership beyond that. When the Big Three met again at the Yalta Conference, in the Soviet Union, in February 1945, they discussed matters that were central to ending the fighting with Germany and with Japan. But Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin also announced that a conference of the United Nations would open in San Francisco on April 25 of that year. Having directed the United States' massive war effort, Roosevelt did not live to see the end of World War II or the creation of the international peacekeeping body. Roosevelt died suddenly on April 12, 1945. The war in Europe ended May 7. And during the closing days of World War II, the UN was chartered. The representatives of the Allied nations met as promised in San Francisco. On June 26, 1945, the governing treaty was signed by the delegates. On October 24, 1945, shortly after the war ended with Japan, the United Nations officially came into existence when the required number of nations approved the charter. 50 nations were members of the UN at the outset. Today the membership numbers 191.
What does the letter X in Malcolm X's name stand for?
The influential but controversial African American leader, who was a staunch defendant of black rights, took the surname X in 1952, upon his release from prison. He explained that the letter stood for the unknown African name of his ancestors. Malcolm X's family's name, Little, was that given to his slave ancestors by their owner. By adopting X as his surname, it was at once a bitter reminder of his family's slavery and an affirmation of his unknown African roots.
What does 5440 or fight mean?
The slogan refers to a dispute between the United States and Great Britain over Oregon Country, which in 1818 treaty allowed both nations to occupy. This was the territory that began at 42 degrees north latitude, the southern boundary of present-day Oregon, and extended north to 54 degrees 40 minutes north latitude, in present-day British Columbia. During the 1830s and early 1840s, American expansionists insisted that U.S. rights to the Oregon Country extended north to latitude 54 degrees 40 minutes, which was then the recognized southern boundary of Russian America, roughly present-day Alaska. The 11th President of the United States, James K. Polk, 1795 to 1849, used the slogan in his political campaign of 1844. After he was elected, Polk settled the dispute with Great Britain, in 1846, and the boundary was set at 49 degrees north, the northern boundary of what is today Washington state and the border between the United States and Canada. This agreement, reached without the fight threatened in the slogan, gave the United States the territory lying between 42 and 49 degrees north latitude, and Great Britain the territory between 49 degrees and 54 degrees 40 minutes north latitude, as well as Vancouver Island. The United States portion is present-day Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, as well as parts of Montana and Wyoming.